My name is Brett Bricker. I coach debate at the University of Kansas and Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart. Today I'm going to be talking to you about non-military strategies. It'll be beginning, I'll just give you kind of like the preview of where we're headed. First, we're going to quickly talk about the meanings of security cooperation. This is something that was introduced in Kevin's topic lecture, and assuredly you've had some debates about if you've been reading either the Department of State Counterplan or the Department of Defense Trade-off DA. We'll talk about a survey of negative positions that are reliant upon this meaning of the word security cooperation, and opportunities for future research. So this will hopefully give you a framework to set up how you want to explore what I think is a pretty important part of the topic for once you leave camp and you start to think about what your first files will look like for Green Hill or the Washburn Rural Tournament. I personally have some attention issues, so I'm gonna go on a lot of tangents and just bear with me. Okay, so first, I want you to pay attention to this lecture. Coach Katz in the back has already told me that he's going to write a bunch of names down for the people that are playing games, so he's our surveiller. I've seen some cool ones. I've seen that snake game. I've seen that ball rolling down the hallway thing. You all are doing a lot of that good work in the back. But I promise you that there will be something that you can take away from this lecture. So this is potentially a very strong counterplan. In addition to that, it will drastically shape the way that you debate on the topic. Even if you never read the Department of State Counterplan or non-military strategies, it will definitely shape the way that affirmative teams write their argument. So for whatever other argument you plan to go for, thinking through some of the kind of functional or functional requirements on affirmatives will definitely help you prepare for the negative. I also just kind of want to say, you're going to give me, 50 minutes of attention today, and I guarantee you that some of the stuff that you take away, either the files that I'm going to give you or the cards or some of the concepts I give you, will save you time later. So think of it like an investment. Whatever you give me now, I promise you, you will save in time later. Part one, the meaning of security cooperation. You don't have to read the whole card. You can find this card in the Department of State Counterplan. But I just want to briefly summarize kind of the problem with this topic. The word security cooperation means a lot, okay? So this card says that it can mean military aid, arms sales, military capacity building. It can mean personnel exchanges, military exercises, access-related agreements, armament-related agreements, donor nation equipment, institutional capacity building, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. I don't really think it excludes very much. So if you're too in on the topic, you probably feel like your life is going to be very difficult. You can't really predict what affirmatives are coming. Advantage areas are going to be unpredictable, and your fallback might be extremely generic positions that don't really rejoin some of the more substantive components of the 1AC. So despite the fact that security cooperation can mean a lot of different things substantively, the one kind of overarching requirement that it has is that it involves the military. And there, to be honest, really isn't very strong evidence that refutes this core premise. So the military needs to be involved in some way. So this Kerr card, you can also find in the Department of State Counterplan. I believe it's also in the topicality file. Basically says that, despite all of the things that we don't know about security cooperation, it can be a variety of different things. One thing we can know is that it requires involvement from the Department of Defense. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that involvement means, but you should know that that is, if you're writing an affirmative, the kind of first thing that you have to know is what is the reason, the justification for including it beyond the topicality reason. So you have to have an advantage based on it. You have to have a link turned to a DA based on it, or something like that that kind of defends the inclusion of the military. Now, what does including the military mean? These cards are kind of up here to just demonstrate that I'm not really just talking out of my ass. I will give you these cards at the end of the lecture via a Dropbox link, so you don't have to worry about reading them now. They're just there, okay? So DoD involvement can mean a variety of things. So we don't know exactly what it means, and I would say that if we think about the word security cooperation being a debatable term, like what it means to different people, I would say that this is the most ambiguous part of the definitions of security cooperation. So Title 10, which you've been introduced to before in the topic lecture, and it's kind of popped up a couple of times, is the part of US code that actually defines the word security cooperation. So US code is split into titles and chapters. You'll learn a lot about Title 10, Title 22, and Title 50 on this topic. But you should know that Title 10 is the armed forces component of US code. So that's the area that defines security cooperation, and it defines it as the interaction of the Department of Defense with the security establishment of a foreign country. Key word being interaction. So security cooperation might mean that members of the United States military have to interact with the military of a foreign country. Now remember, the card, well, it could also mean funding, which is different than interaction. So this piece of evidence, which I don't think has been produced yet, but will be in the file that I give you at the end of the lecture, says that the difference between security cooperation and security assistance is that security cooperation is funded from DoD accounts. Now remember, this is, I think, pretty different than the interactional requirement that the Title 10 actually defines it as. So interaction is like, do you have someone in a military uniform talking to, communicating with, in the same room as someone else in a military uniform from another country? That would be an interaction. This card kind of disagrees with that and says that it's not so much about the interaction, and instead it is about who administers or funds the program. Okay? And maybe that seems like a semantic distinction at the moment, but as we start to talk about how to craft the ideal counterplan, that distinction is going to matter quite a bit. The final thing that I want to note before we recap this meanings thing is that I actually don't really think that the titles that I talked about earlier are as important as I maybe did day one of camp. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that US code is divvied into chapters. Those are titles divvied into chapters. The original inclination that I had was that anything that goes through the Title 10 process was security cooperation, largely because security cooperation is defined in that chapter. So whenever other authors talk about security cooperation, they often reference that definition. But the reason why my thinking has changed on that is largely because there's very good evidence that says that Title 22 and Title 50, as long as they include military interactions, remember Title 20 is foreign affairs, Title 50 is intelligence, as long as they include military interactions, then they are security cooperation. So let's quickly recap, just the definitions part. Okay, it includes anything about a military-to-military operation. I don't really think that you can exclude it based on substance very easily. It can be an exercise, a protection, an arms sale, an agreement, a conversation, a memorandum of understanding, all sorts of things, but the one thing we know is that it involves the military. You should just know as background, that's largely because security cooperation as an element of our governmental strategy dramatically increased after the September 11th attacks in the United States. Okay, so the war on terror started, and what happened was things that used to be mostly in the realm of foreign affairs and diplomacy were overtaken by Defense Department authorities and funding streams. So the war on terror kind of changed the category of things that fall under security cooperation. Second, you should know that there is a pretty strong definitional requirement for requiring the DoD. In what form is kind of unclear. Remember, that can be administration, interaction, or funding. And depending on which one of those you want to defend, I think crafting a negative counterplan with those in mind is pretty important. And third, even if you never want to read this stuff, and you're just like only going to go for a politics DA or only going to go for a critique, that's totally fine. But you should know that your link arguments will interact with this military component of the plan, or advantages. Okay, first tangent. I'm going to save you all some speaker points. So I've heard the Turkish leader's name mispronounced a fair number of times in these debates. Okay, so we're going to listen to this, and then we're going to, as a group, say the name together.
At how to pronounce the name of this Turkish politician serving as the current president of Turkey. How do you go about pronouncing his name? No, it is not Erdogan, but rather Erdogan. Erdogan. Erdogan, president of Turkey.
Say it with me now. 1, 2, 3. Erdogan. All right, cool. You got it. You just saved yourself like 5 speaker points in the season. Okay, part 2. You know what the definition is. We're going to move towards how those definitions should start to craft negative arguments. You all have had, I think every group has had a chance to review the starter packet. I think almost every group has had some debates on the starter packet, which is fantastic. There are 2 things related to this in the starter packet. The first is the Department of State counterplan. Let's call these the basic negative strategies. Like these are hopefully not what you will be reading at the Washburn World Tournament come September. Okay, so Department of State counterplan. This basically just says that there is a military involvement required for the plan. It doesn't really delve into the debate about whether or not that means funding or interaction or administration. It just says whatever it requires, the military's out. The reason why that's preferable is twofold. One, inclusion of the military requires resources from the Department of Defense's budget. And 2, the more the State Department regains control over foreign assistance, the more likely the U.S. looks like and can act like a credible diplomatic actor. It reduces the militarization of our foreign policy and signals that the State Department can lead in the area of security assistance. I think I've judged 6 debates now and have not seen the internal net benefit extended in the 2NR. If you think that DAs, well, I guess I basically want to say that if I were debating, I probably would extend it more frequently than I'm seeing so far, largely because I think that it suffers from exactly the same problems as the disadvantage. So there's not really a reason that the internal net benefit should be avoided. One thing I want to quickly note, and this is not alluded to in the notes section of that file, is that the more the AF has a military key argument, the more credible the internal net benefit is. The reason for that is just basically pretty simple. Like, if the AF says this is an area where the military either is legally required to act or they have the most expertise or resources to do so, then the counterplan could actually send like a meaningful signal that the State Department is now kind of overtaking an area that was previously delegated towards the military. I want to say towards Title 10, but basically it actually accesses the link to the net benefit a little bit better. The second component of this is the DoD trade-off DA. Again, this is like the most basic version possible. I don't think that this will be the one that we'll have even a week from now at camp, but the argument is that whatever DoD resources are required to do the plan, whether or not that's funding for cooperative logistics or incentives to allies to get them to allow U.S. OCOs, that funding comes from the Department of Defense budget. In doing so, because the Department of Defense budget is flat or finite, or there are internalized requirements that require some trade-off, then that comes from other commitments that we currently have to Asia. Basically, the strength of this DA, and something that I would make note of for maybe using in the future, is that the evidence that says that the region, Europe, trades off with funding for the region, Asia, is actually pretty good, and I think that could kind of serve as a core component of a DA, even if you choose not to make it about the like Taiwan stuff that's currently in the file. And in fact, I probably wouldn't. So that's the starter packet. But we can move much further beyond the starter packet to come up with some ideas for disadvantages. So the first is different versions of the trade-off DA. There are two that I have some evidence for. I'm not sure that they are going to be able to beat some of the primary affirmative responses any better than the current trade-off DA does. But the two that I think have some credibility are the DSCA, which was referenced in lecture number 1. What's the DSCA? Anybody have a hand? Yep. Oh, right behind you. Perfect, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. Mr. Hearn put a card up on day 1 that said that, similar to the evidence that we've seen today, that all security cooperation involves the DSCA. Okay, so that seems pretty good fodder for saying that this particular agency can maybe have to spend resources or time or energy, and they might trade off with or not be able to execute something that they're trying to do now. The second one is a more traditional trade-off DA that basically says that the military has other things that they want to spend their money on. So the two cards that I've seen so far are about the OMFV, which you should write the acronym, but I actually can't remember what it means, which is it's basically a military platform that was instituted under Trump and was considered to be cut by Biden, or Biden was considering cutting it in his most recent military budget, and he chose not to. But there's very good evidence that says that it was basically like the next thing that could be cut. And then nuclear modernization, which basically a similar argument. Under Trump, the military chose to spend a lot of money on nuclear modernization, and the Biden administration has considered cutting it, and there's evidence that says that it is on the chopping block, or if new funding comes from other places or they face a budget crunch, that's what gets cut. The final thing I want to say about this is Ukraine. I think Ukraine has like cast a big shadow over the whole topic. I don't think that many affirmatives or negatives have really figured out a way to successfully integrate Ukraine into their debates. But if you're really interested in it, this is a place where you could go. This is a path that you could travel. Some of the more recent security cooperation initiatives have been in and with Ukraine. And given that that's the best non-unique to the DA, I always think it's useful to consider writing that as the DA, because otherwise you're going to struggle versus that thumper. Second, oversight. So remember, these are disadvantages to using the military, involving the military, or making the military the primary actor for the plan. There's a great research group in my lab that's doing some fantastic work on an oversight DA. Shout out you all. The basic argument is that military funding streams are subjected to far less oversight than civilian funding streams. So the most simple way to think about this is the plan's funding stream. Congress doesn't get to say, like, is your money being allocated effectively? Is your money not going to human rights abusers? Is your money not going to corrupt institutions? So Congress plays a role in overseeing the way that funding is spent, except for military streams. And there's very strong evidence that says that Title X and the military funding are basically not subjected to those. So that can be both kind of a no solvency argument, or it could be a reason why the plan generally undermines Congress's ability to execute foreign policy effectively. Third, civil-military relations. Archer.
Sorry, for the oversight this had, what's the answer to just like all the money that we spend on the military as well?
Yeah, all of these have uniqueness problems. We're going to get there. Yeah, I think almost all of these disadvantages, and maybe I should have led with this. When I first chose to do this lecture, which was about a month ago now, this is after I had done maybe like a week of T research, and I would have said with like 100% certainty the core negative position on this topic was DoD bad and the kind of some non-DoD counterplan. I'm not totally sure I'm in that place now. So I think it's necessary. I think it will shape affirmative strategy writing, but all of the debates that I've seen so far have had uniqueness problems for a lot of these disadvantages. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategizing to beat those, but just note that all of these, when I say them, there is the problem of security cooperation with NATO now and security cooperation with Ukraine now. Both of those are concerns. Third, CMR. The Bergman article, which is the 1NC solvency advocate for the Department of State counterplan, there are different recuttings of that article that say that when the US prioritizes military relationships with other countries, the signal that that sends to that country is that traditional foreign policy issues should now be under the header of the military. Sorry, CMR stands for Civil Military Relations. One element of that I mentioned earlier is that those relationships, as they develop, tend to deprioritize human rights. So there are two kind of elements to this. One is the lack of congressional oversight means that US funding can go towards human rights violators. In theory, military spending should not do that because of what's called the Leahy Amendment. But the Leahy Amendment is riddled with loopholes and actually lacks congressional oversight. So military funding can go to human rights violators. A lot of this evidence is about state building operations, which does not really apply to the way that US gives funding to NATO. But I think that there are some ways to work it in particular with the more authoritarian states in NATO, like Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. The second element to this is related to the actual the power that is given to leaders in other countries when they get military funding. So it's part of it is domestic, about congressional oversight here. Part of it is once autocrats and human rights violators see that they are validated by interactions with the US military, they can commit more of those human rights violations. Next is encirclement. I think that there is a fantastic link card for this that says that over-militarization of foreign policy makes, in particular, Russia feel encircled. There's a great link card. Again, we're obviously struggling with uniqueness, but I'm just pointing out what these DAs can look like. There's an entrapment DA, and I'll include the card for this in the final set of files that I give you, but basically the argument is that US military assistance to countries causes those countries to act more aggressively and to violate US foreign policy interests. And it's, okay. So that's just the preview of the disadvantages. I promise you there is a link card for all of these, but debating them becomes much more difficult when you start to think about uniqueness. Okay, quick tangent. Does fiat solve the DoD trade-off link? The affirmative argument versus DoD trade-off is that the plan, because it, I guess is a plan, it says the federal government gets to not trade off with other resources. There's a variety of ways that it could do this. It could raise taxes so it wouldn't trade off with Asia. It could deficit spend so it wouldn't trade off with Asia as it relates to the starter packet. It could come from other places that the affirmative specifies that aren't the negatives disadvantage. This is certainly a debatable question, but I think that absent some plan specification, the answer is no. And basically, here's my pitch. One is kind of descriptive. There is a strong set of evidence that says that when the military does security cooperation, those resources come from existing budgets. So security cooperation comes from, there's evidence that says that it comes from the nuclear budget, from other security cooperation initiatives. There's evidence that says that all military spending has to come from other regional priorities. Okay, those cards are good enough to make me think that that the disadvantage is not entirely contrived. And so that's kind of descriptively. You have some evidence that helps you refute that claim. The most persuasive argument to me is the set of evidence that says that just under the Biden administration, the military budget is likely to remain flat. So Biden wants to cut the military budget. Biden doesn't want to increase the military budget. So choosing to deficit spend and broadly expand the overall military budget is just not something that this administration said that they would do, and not something that they're going to seek to do in Congress. So that's kind of descriptively. Do you have some evidence to support it? Secondarily, I think you could argue that normatively, it's kind of a bad model for debate to allow the affirmative to use fiat to solve the trade-off disadvantage. There's kind of two reasons for that. One is that the negative is having a very difficult time with disadvantages this year. Okay, so if this disadvantage is a disadvantage, then I think that we could potentially say that it's just good to craft interpretations of fiat that give the negative like a little bit more breathing room. In addition, an affirmative that does not specify in their plan where their funding comes from is inevitably going to specify in the 2AC in a advantageous way for the affirmative. Like they have no incentive in debate not to. Like everybody in debate is trying to maximize their likelihood of victory. So if a 1NC link card says the plane comes from Asia, the 2AC is going to say no, the plane comes from the Middle East. But if the 1NC said the plane comes from the Middle East, the 2AC says no, we come from Asia. So the only real way to avoid that self-interested interpretation of fiat is to rely on evidence, which I think mostly favors the negative. Arjun.
If the DoD does become big, do you think it would be strategic to put in the plan where the funding comes from?
So the question is it smart to put in the plan where the funding comes from? If you have like 100% pegged no matter what, that the 2N on the other team can only go for the trade-off DA, maybe, but otherwise I think that struggles with the pick that like comes from another place. If you read that plain text more than once, choose to take it, you know they want to go for the Taiwan DA and you put in your plan that the money should come from deficit spending instead. If you read that plan more than once, a negative team is likely to have a strategy that picks out of that deficit spending component of the plan. So you got to have a justification for why it's good to do so. Okay, so I would be hesitant about doing it absent like an advantage based on that funding stream. Okay, another tangent. You want some files? Pull out your phone. These are the Georgetown files and the Emory files. If you don't have access to them otherwise, this will hopefully expand what you see happening in other places. It's a Dropbox link to my Dropbox. I'm going to delete this in like a day because I don't trust Dropbox security, so one of you is going to get in my stuff. And I have this document called passwords, and I don't want you to see that. Did it work? Yeah. Okay, cool. Save the link. Like send it to your email or something. I'm going to have a couple more QR codes, so make sure that you actually save the link. Okay. Now, this is something that Archon has already mentioned, but life is tough. Okay, I listed like a ton of DAs that I think have a link, and there's actually a pretty strong debate, I would say, about whether or not DoD or not should be leading these initiatives. But there are some pretty significant problems with all of the arguments that I've just talked about. The first is uniqueness, which at this point in the season, I don't have a great fix for. Every one of those disadvantages that I listed suffers from the fact that the United States does a lot of security cooperation with NATO. Quick tangent, this wasn't supposed to be the NATO topic. This was supposed to be the emerging tech topic. Okay, so we were supposed to be having just debates about that. That would have been pretty cool. But at the topic committee, one of the decisions that was made was that topic might not be international enough, so NATO was added to the topic. That's okay. We'll be fine. The community will succeed. But I would say that there wasn't really maybe as much foresight as I would have hoped, given to the question of what is a unique disadvantage for the negative. So, and also, like, the topic was crafted prior to Ukraine, the Ukraine invasion, not the country. So the problem with that is that, you know, all of United States foreign policy that might have been unique to that region, and still there would have been some uniqueness problems, was kind of upended by the fact that now there was billions of dollars spent in NATO partner country, and the US spent a lot more money with NATO and dedicated a lot more resources to NATO to kind of demonstrate that the United States was committed and tried to say that Russia should not expand their operations past Ukraine. Second problem, AFs don't have to do very much. So the encirclement DA, the evidence is about you know, expanded troops. There aren't really great arguments why the AF requires troops. I'd say that it's completely possible that the AF could be topical with a Zoom call that requires basically nothing other than free software. They would encrypt it and stuff, but like, you know, so the amount of money or resources or time or energy or boots on the ground that are necessary, all of those things are much smaller than probably some of those disadvantages assume, but you can still win. Okay, so what do? You just give your strategy a little boost, get them over that wall. Given that I think like the most important part about a negative strategy is the link, and you have a link, then there are some other ways that you can hopefully deal with some of the struggles with these strategies. The first is you should not assume that this starter packet, or even really the research done at camp, will be the thing that drives your success at your season opener. So the link cards that I'm going to give you, those are definitely fodder for negative positions. But what those positions look like might drastically change by something that the government chooses to do in September. And you should be willing to modify and adapt your negative strategy given that. Second, and this is actually hat tip Dr. Scott Harris, who's the director of debate at the University of Kansas. His approach to writing negative arguments is that you take the best AF answer and you put it in the DA. So what's the best AF answer to pretty much every DA? I think it's the Ukraine thumper. So every single position that you craft has to take a stance on Ukraine. It can either be about Ukraine, so you could actually write the Ukraine funding trade-off DA, or you could just make sure that you have staked the position on it in the 1 and C. Either you have a post-dated card, you have a uniqueness card that assumes it, you have a link that's slightly different than some of the stuff that's going on in Ukraine, but in the back of your mind, you should know uniqueness is a big problem, so Ukraine should be front and center in your strategy. Just a brief kind of like behind the scenes to the Department of Defense trade-off DA, there's a card in the 1 and C that assumes Ukraine. That card is not, and it's also a card that says that funding or kind of increased commitment to Europe trades off with Asia. That is not by any means the best card that makes that inter-regional trade-off argument, but it's in the 1 and C solely because of the fact that it talks about Ukraine. So that's helpful because you can say that your evidence actually assumes Ukraine in a way that kind of allows you to start developing the story in the negative block instead of starting the story in the negative block. Third is you should pair it with a solvent counterplan, which will be maybe the next 20 minutes of this lecture. Any bad DA is a lot better if the counterplan solves the whole case. So we will make the counterplan solve the whole case. All right, pull out your phones. One more tangent at least. This is the best debate documentary of all time. Anybody know who Kevin Wilmot is? All right, so you should know who Kevin Wilmot is. He is an award-winning film director. He's worked with Spike Lee. He's a professor at the University of Kansas, and he had 2 students who were film majors travel with the debate team for 2 tournaments. They traveled with us to the Wake Forest tournament, which is where this documentary was created. It just kind of happenstance was we won the tournament that year, which always makes a great documentary. They then traveled with us to the NDT. We did not win the NDT, which made that documentary quite a bit worse. So check this out. It's about 10 minutes long. You'll notice Sean Kennedy is a debater. Sean is a debater or a coach at USC. You'll notice some other familiar faces as well. Lincoln Garrett is sleeping, who was a former Kentucky coach. And yeah, I recommend you give it a read. It's narrated by Kevin Wilmot, which I think is like even way cooler than the debate part of it. Okay, counterplans. You got to make a solvent one because you're not going to have a ton of a DA. I mentioned in my lab that if you're going for the DoD trade-off DA with the SQO, you are doing it wrong. You're going to lose. So you need a counterplan. So what we're going to do now is talk about some of the ways that you can make your non-military counterplan be more powerful than the most basic version of the starter packet. So this card I'll reference later. You don't need to worry about it now. Actually, I'm referencing it now. So NIST. One way to make your non-military counterplan stronger is to start thinking about agencies other than the Department of State. I actually will give you like a minute to read this card. Bonus points. Anybody know, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, anybody know what department it's in? Department of Commerce. All right, cool. You took APUSH. Yes. Hell yeah, okay. So non-military does not just mean Department of State. So as you begin to do affirmative research and you start reading affirmative solvency advocates, one thing that you ought to consider is, do they say some other actor could solve or needs to be involved? This card I think is, mostly strong because it's from a 1AC solvency advocate. I don't really think that, there's actually better evidence for NIST and AI out there, but this solvency advocate I think pretty clearly states that one way to do this is through the DoD, another way to do it would be through NIST. So, there's nothing about the Department of Commerce in the original counterplan file. But if you begin doing AI research and actually some cyber research as well, you might frequently see NIST pop up. Second, picking out of the DSCA. I would say that this gets a little bit more tenuous on competition fronts, but one option is to actually use the military or Department of Defense, but use parts of the Department of Defense that are not the DSCA. Mr. Hearn had a card, and I've found 2 or 3 other cards that say that security cooperation basically is the DSCA. So one way to think about this is to use other parts of the military that are not the DSCA. This isn't the non-military counterplan, but I guess I wanted to mention it here because you could solve a lot of affirmative military key arguments by just excluding this part of the military and reading a disadvantage to it. Third, you could use the CIA. There are strong advocates for using the CIA, largely in the context of state-building operations. Again, it's kind of a drawback to tacking on the phrase security cooperation to this topic with NATO, is that those who are advocating for the CIA to do security cooperation are largely talking about training foreign militaries and foreign security sectors. But it's possible, depending on the affirmative, that will be useful. And you should know that in 1949, we did this with Ukraine. The FDA, the only reason I'm including this is I did a little bit of biotech-related non-military research, and I think that the biotech part of the topic is going to be much smaller than it could potentially be, largely because of the military counterplan, solving a lot of the other things that might be related to biotech, like genetically modified foods, et cetera. If you want to make sure that you can read this counterplan versus biotech affirmatives, I think the FDA is likely the federal agency that I would do some research for about setting international norms on biotech. NASA. So some people are going to talk about space. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a federal agency. The Millennium Challenge Corporation basically sets up financial incentives for companies that receive or that meet governance targets. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation is like if a country can figure out how to democratize their parliament, or move more women into leadership positions in foreign policy, then they get a US grant. So it's a challenge grant. Like the ones that do it most effectively get that. So for countries that try to incentivize a particular type of allied behavior, like it's not about what the US does, it's about convincing allies they need to do something, this is a way that you could use a non-military agency to do that incentivizing. Similar with the National Endowment for Democracy. And then the last kind of tip for this is you can make an agency. The National Security Commission on AI. Did I just make that up? No, in 2018 there was actually a National Security Commission on AI. I didn't know that they did this. I should have paid closer attention to my government class. It was actually a temporary agency made under the Trump administration. So it like exists and then it just disappears once they do the recommendations. I blame my government teacher for that. So that was a non-military agency. They developed a set of recommendations related to AI innovation and standards. They gave them to the federal government, and I don't really think the government did much about it. But you should take that as kind of free rein for saying that it's possible to craft a counterplan that just uses a different agency. You know, a new one that you made with the best people, all the best oversight, all the strongest workers, all the money they need. Why not? Okay, another tangent, but no cards on this one. Yes? Okay, so the question is, this card says that the plan could be the DoD or it could be NIST. And the question is, does that open you up to a permutation? I think it's possible. So my kind of negative understanding of that, from the negative side, would be that this card could be thought of as saying there's one way to do the plan as security cooperation, which is through the DoD. But there's another way to think of the plan as some other type of foreign assistance, which would be through NIST. So the counterplan would be picking out of either the phrase security cooperation in the plan or the topical requirement of security cooperation in the resolution. So that permutation that said do the plan through NIST would be severing that. Now, there's a permutation to do both that has both NIST and the Military Act, and maybe they do it together. Maybe this card is advocating that they ought to cooperate over it, or that it would be more solvent to do it together. In that case, that permutation could solve some net benefits, but would still likely link to a military-based disadvantage because the military would have to be involved. Great question. Okay, tangent, real quick. So these are agent counterplans, which are kind of like, maybe poo-pooed a bit in debate. And I think that agent counterplans get a pretty bad rap because of the way that they work on most topics. So here's a bad one. The federal government should protect water. The counterplan, the executive should protect water. Okay, that's a bad agent counterplan. Largely because, absent some contrived definition, it's very unlikely or difficult to win that protecting water is exclusively non-executive action. So the counterplan, in this case, is really just an example of the plan. It is agreeing that the federal government should protect water because the executive should protect water and the executive is part of the federal government. Another bad one. The USFG should incentivize clean energy. Congress should incentivize clean energy. That's a bad one. Why? Because the counterplan agrees with the plan. Okay? Congress is an example of the federal government. So it's saying, we agree. Congress should be the one that does it, and it requires a somewhat contrived interpretation of federal government to win that counterplan is actually a competitive pick. Okay? But there are some okay ones. Namely, when there is something about the resolution or the plan that requires a particular agent. So here's an example. The federal government should enact a carbon tax. The court should punish fossil fuel producers. there's a permutation that the affirmative could write that instead says the court should enact a carbon tax. Why is that not a successful permutation? Arjun?
Because an act requires Congress.
Enact requires Congress is not exactly what I was thinking, but there we go. Courts can't tax. Yep. So courts can't do the thing that the plan fiat happens. Okay. You're pretty good. It was okay. Okay. You were right. You were right as well. Yeah. Okay. So this is an agent counterplan that changes the agent of the plan, and in my opinion, it is more competitive, more kind of an actual test of the plan, largely because of there being an agential requirement for a carbon tax. Similarly, the AF is the United States federal government should SC with NATO, increase security cooperation with NATO. And it's actually with the NATO. It's going to matter a lot in a week. Neg, USFG should increase non-security cooperation with the NATO through, is that an agent pick? We got a yes. Let's hear it. Perfect. This is an agent counterplan. Good. It has the same actor, USFG, but because of the requirement of the phrase in the plan text, it is picking out of and using a different agent than the plan. All right. So military counterplans, every AF is going to have a military-related deficit. I think that they should usually lose. Largely because a military deficit in an affirmative does not assume the power of fiat. First, on the negative, you can fiat the military in your non-military counterplan. Let me explain. The topical requirement of security cooperation is that militaries interact. Someone who's wearing a United States military uniform sits in a room, a Zoom call, who knows, has a conversation with someone who is wearing a military uniform from another country. Maybe that has NATO regalia on it. I don't know about that part yet. But the negative can fiat the military as long as the military does not interact with a foreign country. So for example, the OCO's AF, great AF, I think it has a relatively strong, maybe military key argument. But it doesn't have a very strong argument for why our military needs to sit down with a military from NATO allies. Okay? So a counterplan versus the OCOF could just use the Department of State, which a lot of NATO interaction happens with diplomats, and then also fiat that, like back home in DC, the military is like, we agree, thumbs up, whatever the Department of State said, we are cool with. That competes because it is not security cooperation. The military is not interacting with a foreign ally. Let's say the military key argument is like, the military needs to do more OCOs, or not do as many OCOs, or not use lethal autonomous weapons. You can have the State Department do all of the foreign interaction, and then fiat that the military follows through with whatever doctrinal requirements are set up in that negotiation. This, I think, is probably the strongest way to write that counterplan to get out of a lot of affirmative solvency deficits. All of the other examples I'm about to give, I think, are less competitive than this one. I think there's basically like no strong argument for this being not competitive. I think it competes. I think it's pretty solvent. The other examples that I'm going to give, I think, maybe suffer at the competition level a bit. Remember that security cooperation kind of hinges on these somewhat ambiguous words like administration or involvement. So one thing that you could do is you could have another department that's not the military administer the foreign assistance. but have military actually doing the interaction. Depending on which definition of security cooperation you're reading, this might compete, but I think it's very, very hard for the affirmative to win a solvency deficit to this version of the counterplan. I think even harder to win a solvency deficit is to use non-military funding, but include military interaction. I think this, absent the 1AC reading like a trade-off-based advantage, I think that this might be almost impossible to beat at a solvency level. So the way that this would work is basically have non-military agencies fund it, but fiat that what they're funding is the military doing the interacting. That can be arms sales, communication, memorandums, capacity building, et cetera. Military actually does it. The only difference is that it comes from a different funding stream. And I think that's very, very hard for an affirmative to beat at the solvency level. And the final piece of advice on this front is a hat tip to JP, which just said, make the non-military counterplan an advantage counterplan. So include one plank that's like do the plan non-militarily, and then figure out what their deficit is. Maybe that deficit is like, if we don't communicate with other countries, then our allies are going to get mad at us, and that will undermine US-European trade. Counterplan. Do the plan, except for non-security cooperation. Another plank, boost US-EU trade. Okay, so you can do things that are totally unrelated to the plan to solve their deficits. I think this is my next to last tangent. Open your phone's podcast app and download this podcast, NATO 2020. This, I think, is the most important podcast that you could listen to on the topic. Okay, so this podcast is a series of 20 episodes where policymakers give recommendations about how NATO ought to change, and then there's a debate about it, where those advocates go on the episode, and a longtime NATO journalist debates them about the viability of those proposals. I can say with almost absolute certainty that several of the recommendations on these podcasts will be AFs. The other thing that I think is super useful about this is that the debate as it unfolds is very helpful for understanding solvency for a lot of affirmatives, because a lot of her pushback against these are allies would disagree, the US doesn't have enough clout to convince allies to do so, and NATO's distracted with other things right now, so it's unlikely they could actually succeed at doing so. It's I think you'll see in some files that are coming out Sunday, those are pretty legitimate responses to a lot of affirmatives. Did you find it, Fiona? Everybody got it? Okay, cool. Download it. It's 20 episodes. Do it from when you're connected to a Wi-Fi so you don't use your parents' data. Okay. A little bit about affirmative responses, and then we will take a quick break. So the strongest versions of the counterplans that I just talked about probably need a set of competition-based responses. But against most non-military counterplans, you need to think of a military key argument. And a lot of debaters think about that like, well, we need a hedge advantage, or we need like a deterrence advantage. But it actually really needs to be about interaction between United States military actors and military officials from NATO allies. Second, you should remember the power of non-unique. So before every tournament, when I debated, what we did before every tournament was we cut like econ updates, econ high-low, political capital updates, political capital high-low. Those are great. You should have those too. Before every tournament that you compete at this year, you should have a card from that week that says security cooperation just increased. That is not hard to do. Okay? Pretty much every initiative the Department of State plasters on their website and says, here's a new awesome thing that we just did. Okay? So they have an incentive to talk about it pretty frequently. On the AF, I would stay way updated on these fronts. Third, and I've alluded to this already, just remember that your AF doesn't have to do very much. If you're choosing an AF that chooses to spend billions of military dollars, I salute you, but it might not be the most strategic thing to do. Okay, opportunities for future research. These are things that if I was giving the lecture like 2 weeks from now, I feel like I could maybe have some cards on, but I just didn't. I didn't kind of find them, camp caught up with me, etc. I think that there is going to be a strong negative position at some point during the year that says that the military should not be the ones kind of taking hold of the future of emerging tech. So military standard setting is bad. Military, and if you just think about this, like, you know, if you think about the most generic biotech app, like the, you know, come up with standards to ensure that biotech is safe. If other countries look at us and they're like, weirdly, it's the United States military that's doing this, I would imagine that people are making the argument that these need to be non-military. Second, there are going to be disadvantaged link arguments about specific oversight committees. One of the primary differences between the military and non-military types of foreign assistance, or categories of foreign assistance, is who in Congress oversees them. So security cooperation is overseen by armed forces and armed services committees. Non-military foreign assistance is largely overseen by foreign affairs committees. If you write politics DAs specific to those agencies, I don't think they will link to your counterplan, and they will be very unique or different from some of the stuff that's been produced so far. The last opportunity for future research is NAC-related counterplans. I have 2 cards, one of which is from a podcast that says that the United States interactions at the NAC, which is the consensus group at NATO, that is done by diplomats. And I haven't really found a card that says that that is commonly or even possibly done by US military officials, despite the fact that it is a military alliance, which makes me think that there are both NAC-related DAs and counterplans, because I don't know if the plan can use the NAC if they are exclusively using the DoD, and I think that if the plan is exclusively using the Department of State, you might be able to get some solvency arguments based on going through that normal process of consensus building in NATO. I'm less confident in this last one, largely because it's like one-offs in a couple of articles that I've found, and because I think that the AF largely gets to fiat Department of State and Department of Defense, but this is, I'm including the link just in case you all are interested in it. Okay, last thing. Every card that I've talked about from this lecture you can find here. It's another Dropbox link. It's a document. Most of the cards that I talked about today are not out yet, so you can't read any of these cards in debates until they've been produced by the camp. But probably the most important part about the document that you just got is the link section for military DAs. I think that the link is strong, and you'll be able to use some of those as you start to innovate and craft more negative arguments that hopefully account for some of the weaknesses that I talked about today. Okay, we got a few minutes for questions, and then we will take a quick break and then pass it over to Mr. Katz. Questions? Yeah, I do think people will read a state's counterplan. I wish I included that link. The state's counterplan that I think people will read will use state National Guards. And the reason why I think that they will do so is that our state National Guards actually do cooperation with NATO. there are partnership programs where they like do combo training exercises with NATO, which I'm not totally sure how many AFs that's going to perfectly relate to, but I think that that is definitely a possibility.
With like all these different agent counterplans, do you think like agent counterplans bad as theory is going to be viable?
The question is agent counterplans bad theory viable? Yes, I mean, I think that you could certainly, it's viable. I think it's far less persuasive than on previous topics where, one, there wasn't an agent required by the most important phrase of the resolution, and two, negative ground was a little bit better than it is on this topic. So if the negative had like another great counterplan or a series of disadvantages that were unique, I think there could be a compelling kind of normative argument that it would be beneficial to exclude agent counterplans because the neg had enough already. Thus far, that I find that argument to be a little bit less compelling because I think the negative is fighting a tough battle on this topic. I think everyone's fighting a tough battle, but negatives in particular. Cora.
I guess how would the like create a new agency counterplan interact with strategic counterplan given no definitions like are in the context of like conversation used against security cooperation agency? Is there a way?
Well, I wouldn't call it a security cooperation agency. I would call it a non-security cooperation agency. So the question is, create a new agency. Does that lose to perm do the counterplan? Certainly, it could. I would say that there are two things in its favor. One is the set of evidence that says that security cooperation requires the military generally. So if you make an agency that's not the military, then it is not security cooperation. And second, the evidence that says that the plan requires the DSCA, and the counterplan would not use the DSCA. But there are definitely people that are a little bit more AF-leaning on these questions than me that would say that the creation of a new agency could maybe be a new type of security cooperation, especially if it explicitly mandated all of the same things as the plan. The one thing I would be concerned about in creating a new agency is like the more that you specify like they get all the money that they want and the more that they get like all the resources that they want, that seems a little bit more susceptible to AF perm tricks. Okay, my email is brickerb@umich.edu. You can email me with questions if you have them about today's lecture. If any of these like links don't end up working for you, I'm happy to ship them back out. You get 5 minutes, so be in your seats at 11:12.